Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's get into it. I never really believed in ghosts. Sure, it heard stories, urban legends passed down from older kids trying to scare us. Late night campfire horror tales meant to make you check over your shoulder. But I always figured there was a logical explanation for everything. Shadows at night were just tricks of the light. Strange noises? Probably the wind or an animal. That was my mindset. Until that night. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where nothing ever really happened. My friends and I had spent most of our teenage years trying to find ways to keep ourselves entertained. That usually meant late night drives, meeting up at the same old diner, or sneaking into places we weren't supposed to be. One of those places was Carter Road, a long, forgotten stretch of pavement that barely showed up on any maps. It was miles away from town, surrounded by dense forest on both sides, and hadn't been in use for years. Nobody knew why it had been abandoned, but there were plenty of stories. Some said people had vanished there, their cars found with the doors open, engines still running. Others talked about a hitchhiker who appeared out of nowhere, only to disappear the second you took your eyes off him. I always thought those stories were just small-town nonsense. But one thing was true, people avoided that road. Even the most reckless kids, the ones who thrived on breaking rules, never went near it. It was a cold Saturday night in October when we made the decision. There were 4 of us that night, me, my best friend, and 2 others. We'd spent the evening at our usual diner, drinking cheap coffee and trying to figure out what to do. Someone brought up Carter Road, and at first, we laughed it off. But as the minutes passed, we realized nobody was actually saying no. It wasn't like we had anything better to do. The drive out there took about an hour. The further we got from town, the quieter it became. At some point, I realized there were no more streetlights, no houses, no signs of life. Just miles of cracked asphalt, lined by towering trees that swayed in the winds. The deeper we went, the more I felt it, that strange, suffocating feeling like we were being watched. I didn't say anything, but I could tell I wasn't the only one who felt it. Finally, we saw it, the entrance to Carter Road. It was marked by an old rusted sign, barely hanging on to its post. Someone had spray painted over the words, but you could still make out what it once said, "Road closed." I should have turned around right then. As soon as we passed the rusted sign, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a shift in the air, like the whole road had been waiting for us. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked pavement ahead. But the deeper we went, the more I noticed how unnaturally still everything was. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant howls of animals. Just silence. I didn't say anything at first, but I could tell the others felt it too. My best friend in the passenger seat glanced over at me, his fingers drumming against his knee, a nervous habit of his. "Man, this place is dead," he muttered, forcing a chuckle. Literally, nobody laughed. The road stretched ahead, winding through the trees, disappearing into the distance. The asphalt was worn and cracked, with deep fissures running along the edges where weeds had begun reclaiming the space. We drove slow, the tires crunching over loose gravel, and for a while, nothing happened. But then I noticed something small but off. The road signs. Every few minutes, we'd pass one. Speed limits, caution signs, warnings about sharp turns, but they weren't normal. The reflective paint was faded, but as my headlights hit them, I saw something strange. The words had changed. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The first sign should have said, "Speed limit 35, but it looked like it had been scratched over, the numbers almost unreadable. Then we passed another, and this one was worse. The words "dead end" had been clawed at, like something had scraped deep grooves into the metal. I didn't say anything right away. Maybe it was just vandalism. Maybe kids came out here to mess with the signs. But then we passed another. This one said, "Don't stop," in big, jagged letters. The original message was completely gone. I felt my stomach tighten. "Did you guys see that?" I asked. The guy in the back seat leaned forward. "See what?" "The signs," I said, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "There." I didn't get to finish my sentence. Something ran across the road. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. A blur of movement, pale, thin, too fast for an animal, shot across the asphalt, disappearing into the trees on the other side. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the cracked pavement. My heart was pounding, the adrenaline hitting me like a punch to the chest. "What the hell was that?" my best friend snapped, gripping the dashboard. The backseat passengers scrambled to look out the windows, their breath fogging up the glass. "I don't know," I said, staring into the darkness where the thing had vanished. My headlights barely reached past the tree line, casting long, shifting shadows between the trees. I kept expecting to see a pair of eyes staring back, but there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the empty road ahead and the dense, silent woods beyond it. I swallowed hard. "Did anyone else see that?" My best friend nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I don't know what I saw." The guy in the back seat exhaled sharply. "Dude, let's just keep driving." I hesitated. Something about this felt wrong. That thing, whatever it was, had moved too fast, too deliberately. And the way it ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an animal at all. But I wasn't about to sit here and wait for it to come back. I pressed down on the gas. The car lurched forward, the tires kicking up small pebbles as we picked up speed. Nobody spoke for a while. The tension in the car was thick, everyone too afraid to say what we were all thinking. Something was out here, and we weren't supposed to be. The car moved forward, but something had shifted. The moment we saw that thing, whatever it was, cross the road, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just an eerie silence anymore. It was something heavier. A pressure, like the air had thickened around us, pushing in from all sides. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my knuckles white, my jaw locked. My best friend sat stiffly beside me, his knees still bouncing, but this time it wasn't just a nervous habit. It was something else. The road stretched ahead, winding through the endless dark. Our headlights flickered against the trees, but the deeper we drove, the stranger everything became. It started small. The odometer was wrong. I glanced down at the dashboard and frowned. We had been driving for at least 10 minutes since the last unsettling incident, but according to the display, we had only gone half a mile. That wasn't possible. I tapped the glass over the screen, as if that would somehow fix it. Nothing changed. The glowing numbers stayed wrong. I swallowed. "Hey, does something feel weird to you?" My best friend exhaled sharply. "Weird how? I feel like we've been driving longer than half a mile." He frowned. "What?" I motioned toward the dashboard. "Look at the odometer." He leaned in, squinting at the numbers. I could see his face change in the dim glow of the dashboard. His fingers tensed against his jeans. "That doesn't make sense." "Yeah." The guy in the back seat shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe it's broken. Maybe. Or maybe something else was happening." I didn't want to think about that. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, suddenly. 1 second, it was normal, the kind of mild autumn night you'd expect this time of year. The next, it was freezing. A chill rushed through the car, making my breath come out in faint clouds. My skin prickled. I turned to my best friend. "Do you feel that?" He nodded, rubbing his arms. "Yeah. What the hell?" The backseat passengers were murmuring, shifting in their seats, pulling their jackets tighter. I reached for the car's climate controls. The heater was already on, full blast, but it wasn't working. It was still so damn cold. That was when the radio turned on. We hadn't touched it. None of us had even moved toward the dashboard. But suddenly, the static crackled through the speakers, loud and sharp, filling the car. I flinched, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter. "What the hell?" the guy in the back seat muttered. I tried to turn it off. My fingers twisted the knob, pressed buttons, did everything I could, but the static wouldn't stop. It wasn't just noise. It wasn't random. There was something inside the static. A voice. It was faint, buried beneath the distortion, but I heard it a whisper. No, a word. Turn. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I shot a look at my best friend. He had gone pale. "You heard that, right?" I whispered. He nodded slowly. So did the others. Nobody said anything. We just stared at the radio as the static shifted, as the faint voice twisted into something almost recognizable. "Turn back." I slammed the power button. The static stopped. Silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Then the guy in the back seat cleared his throat. "We should leave." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I wanted to. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to hit the gas, to get off this damn road. But there was a problem. We had been driving straight this entire time. And yet, somehow, we were still on the same stretch of road. I knew it. The same faded road signs, the same bent guardrails, the same gnarled tree leaning just a little too far over the pavement. We had been passing them over and over and over. I should have noticed earlier. I took a slow breath. "Guys." They turned toward me, their eyes wide, their faces tight with unease. "I think we're driving in circles." Nobody spoke at first. Then my best friend shook his head. "No way. That's not." He stopped, looked out the window, and saw it. That same damn tree. His throat bobbed. "What the hell?" I pressed harder on the gas. The car sped up, the headlights stretching further into the darkness. The speedometer climbed, 30, 40, 50 miles per hour. But we were still here, still on the same damn road. One of the guys in the back whispered, "How is that possible?" I didn't have an answer. I just kept driving. Then the headlights flickered. For half a second, everything went dark. Pitch black. And in that fraction of time, I saw something standing in the middle of the road. It was pale, thin, too tall. It was looking directly at us. The headlights came back. The road was empty. I couldn't breathe. "What was that?" someone gasped. I didn't answer. I didn't know what I saw, but I knew it was watching us. And then, the car stopped. Not because I hit the brakes, not because of anything I did. It just stopped moving. The engine was still on. The dashboard lights were still glowing, but the car wasn't rolling forward anymore. It was as if some invisible force had grabbed us and was holding us in place. I slammed my foot against the gas pedal. The engine roared, but we didn't move. My best friend turned toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." Then the doors unlocked on their own. All 4 locks clicked open at the same time. A gust of freezing air rushed into the car. And outside, in the trees, something moved. Not just one thing. Several. The silence in the car was suffocating. None of us spoke. None of us moved. We barely even breathed. The only sound was the distant rustling in the trees, a noise that shouldn't have been as loud as it was. Because it wasn't just the wind. Something, or many somethings, were moving in the darkness. I could hear the shifting of branches, the crackling of leaves underfoot, the unmistakable sound of something circling us. The doors were unlocked. The realization hit me like a hammer to the chest. Someone or something had unlocked them, My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached. I glanced at my best friend. His breathing was shallow, his fingers hovering near the door handle, as if somehow he could keep it shut by sheer will. The two in the back seat were frozen, their faces twisted with the kind of fear that sinks deep into your bones, the kind that makes you question if you'll ever feel safe again. Then we heard it. A voice! But it wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was coming from outside the car. Low, rasping, barely above a whisper, but right there, just beyond the glass. Get out. I stopped breathing. My best friend flinched, his hands clenching into fists. Did you hear that? None of us needed to answer. The tension in the car was unbearable. Then it spoke again. Only this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a chorus. Multiple voices, layered over each other, each one distorted and wrong, rising from every direction. They filled the space around us, turning the silent forest into a living nightmare. Get out. I reached for the gear shift. Reverse. The engine sputtered. The car didn't move. I tried again. I pushed my foot against the gas. The engine roared, but we went nowhere. Something was holding us here. Then something touched the car. A dull thud against the back. Another against the side. A scraping sound, nails, claws, something worse, dragging along the metal frame. I turned my head toward the window. I wish I hadn't, because that's when I saw them. Figures, tall, thin, impossibly stretched. Their faces were blank, almost human, but not. Their skin was pale, too pale, like something that had never seen sunlight. Their arms hung too low, their fingers nearly brushing the ground as they moved. And they were all watching us. I couldn't scream. My best friend was shaking. I could hear his breath coming in fast, uneven gasps. One of the backseat passengers whimpered. What? What are they? Nobody answered, because none of us knew. Then the windows fogged up. A cold mist crept over the glass, thick and unnatural. And in the condensation, something started writing. Letters. Words. We let you see. I stared, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The writing shifted. The letters twisted, forming something new. Now you let us in. A knock on the window. Slow. Deliberate. A handprint formed in the fog. Then another. And another. They were everywhere. We had to move. We had to do something. But before I could react, the passenger door swung open. My best friend barely had time to react before something lunged. A hand, too long, too many joints, snatched at his arm. He screamed. I grabbed him, yanking him back, slamming the door shut with everything I had. The second it clicked, the car lurched forward on its own. I didn't question it. I didn't stop to think. I hit the gas. The car moved this time. Tires screeched, kicking up dirt and gravel as we sped down the road. The figures outside didn't chase us, not exactly. They just watched. Their heads tilted at impossible angles, their blank faces following us as we drove faster, 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 until they were gone. And just like that, everything went back to normal. The radio was silent. The air was warm again. The road, somehow, was different. No more looping. No more impossible distance. We drove in silence. Nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, my best friend exhaled a shaky breath. We're not telling anyone about this. No one argued. Because we knew the truth. Nobody would believe us anyway. We didn't stop driving. I kept my foot on the gas, my grip so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles had gone white. My best friend sat beside me, silent, his face pale and tense. The two in the back seat didn't say a word either. No one even dared to ask if we had really escaped, because none of us wanted to hear the answer. The road stretched ahead, dark and winding, but something felt different now. The suffocating presence that had been pressing in on us for what felt like hours was suddenly gone. The forest outside the windows no longer seemed endless. The twisted trees no longer felt like they were leaning toward us, watching us. Still, I didn't let up on the gas. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them standing there, watching us disappear into the distance. But the road behind us was empty. No figures, no flickering shapes. Nothing at all. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel real. We should have been relieved. We should have been celebrating that we had somehow escaped whatever nightmare we had just experienced. But instead, we just sat there in silence, the tension so thick it felt like another presence in the car with us. The further we drove, the more my mind started racing. Had we really left them behind? Or had they let us go? That last thought made my stomach turn. We let you see. Now you let us in. The words had been burned into my memory. The fog on the windows, the handprints, the way those figures just stood there, not attacking, not chasing, just waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't want to know. Finally, the road changed. The cracked pavement turned smoother, newer. The trees that had loomed so close to the edges of the road pulled back, making way for open sky. And then, after what felt like an eternity, we saw it. A sign. A real sign. A proper green and white road sign, covered in reflective paint that caught the glow of my headlights. It wasn't some old, rusted thing covered in moss like the ones we had seen earlier. It was new, modern. It had directions. It had a town name. We were back. Somehow, some way, we had made it out. I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "We're out," my best friend whispered, like he didn't fully believe it. The two in the back seat remained silent. One of them let out a shaky sigh. The other just sat there, head down, gripping their knees like they were afraid to move, afraid that if they acknowledged we were free, something would come and drag us back. I couldn't blame them. My hands were still shaking. My body was still tense. Every part of me wanted to believe we were safe now, that we had just been lost on some strange, unmarked road in the middle of nowhere, that our minds had played tricks on us. But I knew better. I had felt those hands grab at my best friend. I had seen those figures through the fogged-up glass. I had heard the voices, layered, inhuman, impossible. That wasn't a trick of the mind. That wasn't just paranoia or exhaustion. Something had been there with us. Something had let us go. I pressed down on the gas, pushing the car past the speed limit, desperate to put as much distance between us and that road as possible. Nobody protested. Nobody told me to slow down. Nobody looked back. We finally stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town. It was a brightly lit place, buzzing with the hum of fluorescent lights, the kind of generic stop you'd find anywhere. It should have felt safe. It should have felt normal. It didn't. We all got out of the car, stretching stiff limbs, trying to shake off the nightmare we had just left behind. My best friend leaned against the hood, arms crossed, staring at the ground like he was somewhere else entirely. The two from the back seat headed straight inside. They didn't even say anything. They just went straight to the bathroom, their movements robotic, their eyes unfocused. I stayed outside, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to clear my head. I needed to convince myself that this was over. Then my best friend spoke. "You saw them too, right?" His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous in his tone, something fragile, like he was begging me to say no, to tell him it had all been in his head. I looked at him. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. He saw the truth in my expression. His jaw clenched. He turned away, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't," he started, but he stopped himself. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't want to talk about it." "Me either," I admitted. And we didn't. Not then. Not ever. We drove home in silence. The road back was normal. The signs made sense. The GPS worked again. Everything was exactly how it should have been. But something still felt wrong. Like something had shifted inside of us. Like something had followed us home. That night, when I finally made it to my room, I locked my door. I closed my curtains. I turned on every single light. And then I stared at my reflection in the mirror for far too long. Not because I looked different, but because, for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was alone. I don't talk about that night. None of us do. Not because we agreed to stay silent, but because we can't. There are some things that don't belong in words, things that change the moment you try to explain them. That night is one of those things. But just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean it isn't there. It lingers. It follows. It waits. Weeks passed, and we all tried to pretend that life had gone back to normal. We went to work. We saw our families. We laughed at stupid jokes and acted like nothing had changed. But it had. I saw it in the way my best friend checked over his shoulder when he thought no one was watching. I saw it in the way the others refused to take the back roads home, how they avoided dark places, how they flinched when they saw condensation forming on glass. I saw it in myself too. I left the lights on at night. I started waking up at odd hours, heart pounding, with no memory of why. I stopped looking at mirrors. And every now and then, just when I was about to convince myself that we had escaped, that we had just been tired and scared and lost, something would happen. A whisper in a silent room. A handprint on the bathroom mirror after a shower, even when I hadn't touched it. The feeling of being watched. The air turning too cold, too still, just for a second. Little things. Things that could be explained. Things I didn't want to explain. Because the moment I let myself acknowledge them, the moment I admitted that they were real, I knew. They'd know too. Months passed, and then a year. We moved on. Or at least, we pretended to. And maybe, for a little while, I believed that we had left it all behind. That it was just one bad night on a road that we would never drive again. But then, late one evening, my phone buzzed. A message. From one of them. No greeting. No explanation. Just 3 words. It happened again. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't respond. I didn't have to, because in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. We had never really left that road, and it had never really left us. I never thought I'd tell this story. Even now, thinking back to it makes my skin crawl. It's something I've tried to forget, something I pushed so far into the back of my mind that it almost felt like a bad dream. But it wasn't. It happened, and every detail is burned into my memory. This happened a few years ago when I was in my mid-20s. I had just moved to a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest excitement is the annual fair. It wasn't much, but it was peaceful. That's what I wanted. Somewhere I could clear my head, get away from the noise of the city, and start fresh. I rented a small cabin at the edge of town. It was nothing fancy, just a 1-bedroom place with an old fireplace, a creaky wooden floor, and a tiny kitchen that barely fit a table. But the best part? The backyard stretched into miles of untouched forest. The kind of place where you could sit outside at night and hear nothing but the wind through the trees. It was perfect. At least, that's what I thought. I worked at a hardware store in town, stocking shelves, handling deliveries, the usual stuff. The job was easy, and the people were friendly. Every morning, it'd stop by the diner for coffee before heading to work, and by evening, it'd be back at my cabin, enjoying the silence. There was only one road leading to my place, a narrow dirt path that wound through the woods. It was beautiful during the day, sunlight filtering through the trees, birds chirping, the occasional deer darting across. But at night, it was a different story. The forest swallowed the light, turning everything into a wall of black. No streetlights, no passing cars, just an eerie emptiness that stretched for miles. I had always been comfortable alone. I liked the quiet. But something about that forest felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a strange sense that the trees were watching. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I wasn't used to this level of isolation. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't the only one who felt it. One evening at the diner, I was chatting with an older guy named Tom. He'd lived in town his whole life and knew just about everything there was to know. When I mentioned where I was living, he gave me a strange look. "That old place?" he said, stirring his coffee. "Not many people stay there long." I laughed it off, thinking he was just messing with me. "Why's that?" He shrugged. "People hear things, see things. Ain't much out there but trees, but..." He trailed off, his eyes shifting to the window. "Just be careful at night." I didn't take him seriously. Every small town had its stories. Besides, I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. It was just a quiet place in the middle of nowhere. But that changed soon. And once it started, it never stopped. It started small. At first, it was little things, things that could be explained, things I told myself were just part of living in an old cabin in the woods. The kind of things you don't really notice until they start piling up. The first time I felt it, I had just gotten home from work. It was late, close to midnight, and the forest was silent, the way it always was at night. I parked my truck, grabbed my things, and made my way up the short path to the front door. I remember stopping for a second, listening. There was nothing, not a single sound. No crickets, no wind, no rustling leaves, just absolute silence. I frowned but didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just one of those nights where the air was still. I went inside, locked up, and got ready for bed. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m., heart pounding. I didn't know why. There was no nightmare, no loud noise that startled me awake. Just a suffocating sense that something was wrong. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to slow my breathing. The cabin was dark, but the moon cast pale light through the window, making long shadows stretch across the floor. Everything was still, too still. Then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound outside. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the wind, there was no wind. And it wasn't an animal. Animals move with purpose, quick and sharp. This was slow, deliberate. It sounded like footsteps. I sat up, my pulse hammering. The sound stopped. I waited, straining my ears. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, that I had woken up disoriented, still half dreaming. Maybe a branch had fallen, or some animal had wandered close and then run off. It was late, I was tired, and I had work in the morning. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and hesitated. The dirt around my cabin was damp from the night's humidity, soft enough to leave marks. And there, just beyond the porch, were footprints. Not boot prints. Bare footprints. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone outside barefoot. They weren't big enough to belong to a grown man, but they weren't small enough to be a child's either. They led from the tree line to my porch, and then stopped. I checked the door. It was still locked. The windows were shut. Nothing was out of place. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. The back window faced the woods, and as I scrubbed a plate, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, expecting to see a deer or some other animal darting through the trees. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest. I dried my hands, leaning closer to the glass. My porch light cast a faint glow into the first few feet of trees, but beyond that, everything faded into darkness. Then I saw it. A figure, not moving, not shifting, just standing there, half hidden between the trees. My throat went dry. I couldn't make out details, just a shape, a pale outline against the darkness. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, it stepped back and vanished. I backed away from the window, my chest tight. My mind scrambled for an explanation, something rational. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe a soft tap against the glass. I froze. Another tap. Slow, purposeful. I turned my head, heart pounding. There was nothing outside. Just my own pale reflection staring back at me. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I went into town and mentioned it to Tom, the old guy from the diner. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was being ridiculous. But he didn't. Instead, he frowned, setting down his coffee. "Did you see its face?" The way he said it made my stomach twist. "No," I said. "It was too dark." Tom exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "Good. Don't try to." That was all he said. I should have asked more. I should have pressed him for details. But part of me didn't want to know. That was mistake number 2. Because whatever it wasn't done with me yet. After my conversation with Tom, I told myself I wouldn't let it get to me. That night, I double-checked every door and window, making sure everything was locked. I kept a flashlight and a hunting knife on my nightstand, just in case. I wasn't going to be caught off guard again. But something had shifted. The unease that had been lingering in the back of my mind since that first night had grown into something heavier, something that sat on my chest and refused to leave. The air inside the cabin felt different, thicker, heavier. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in, waiting. And then the sound started. At first, it was a scratching noise. Faint, barely audible, coming from outside my bedroom window. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind. But when I finally got up to check, stepping cautiously toward the window with my flashlight, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There were no trees close enough to touch the window. And yet, there, etched into the glass, were long, jagged streaks. They weren't cracks. They weren't smudges. They were deliberate, as if something had dragged its nails, its claws, across the surface. I shut the curtains and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, searching for tracks, for anything that could explain what I had seen. The ground was disturbed, but not in any way that made sense. The leaves were scattered, but there were no footprints, no animal tracks. Just empty, trampled earth leading toward the tree line. That night, it got worse. I had just sat down on the couch when I heard it, knocking. Not at the door, on the window. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat, my hands clenching into fists. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the window out of the corner of my eye. There was nothing there. Then, another 3 knocks. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on nothing but my own reflection. But then, I saw it. A second reflection. It was faint, barely there, standing just behind mine. Before I could react, the light flickered, and when it steadied again, the reflection was gone. I spun around, my pulse hammering, but the cabin was empty. I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. But whatever was here with me didn't want to be seen. Not yet. Over the next few nights, the disturbances escalated. The knocking became more frequent. The scratching on the windows grew louder. I started waking up at exactly 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, feeling like someone was watching me. And then, one night, I heard the voice. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, so soft, so close it could have been right next to my ear. My name. I shot up, my chest tight, my eyes darting around the room. The cabin was pitch dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. The voice didn't come again, but I felt something. A presence. It was as if the air around me had thickened, pressing down on my skin, making it hard to breathe. I grabbed the flashlight, my fingers trembling, and swept it across the room. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, that something was still watching. The next day, I drove straight into town and went back to the diner, looking for Tom. I found him sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee like he always did. But when I sat down beside him, he didn't greet me. He just glanced at me once, then shook his head. "I told you not to look," he muttered. I stared at him, my stomach twisting. "What is it?" I asked. "What the hell is happening?" Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked tired, more than tired. He looked worn down. "There's something in those woods," he said. "Something that's been there longer than any of us. Some folks see it. Most don't." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "And the ones who do," Tom hesitated, then lowered his voice, "they don't last long." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Leave," he said. "Get out of that cabin. Don't stay there another night." I wanted to listen. I should have listened. But I had lived in that cabin for years. It was my home. I wasn't about to let something drive me out. That was mistake number 3. That night, I set up cameras around the cabin. I needed proof. I needed to see what was tormenting me. I stayed up, watching the monitors, waiting. Hours passed. The woods were still, silent. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., the motion sensor went off. One of the cameras had picked up movement. I leaned in, my breath shallow. At first, I saw nothing. Just trees. Darkness. The faint glow of the moon. And then, the figure stepped into frame. Pale. Thin. Too tall. It didn't walk so much as glide, its limbs moving unnaturally. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing, tilting its head as if staring directly into the camera. And then it turned and looked straight at me. Not at the camera. At me. My blood turned to ice. I scrambled away from the screen, my chest heaving. The feed flickered, cutting to static. When it returned, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I had my proof. But I had also made a mistake. I had let it know that I saw it. And now, it was coming closer. The moment I saw that thing on the camera, its unnatural posture, the way it seemed to know I was watching, I felt a terror I had never known before. This wasn't just some shadow in the corner of my eye, or the sound of knocking in the night. It was real. It had form. And now, it knew that I knew. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my things, get in my truck, and drive as far as I could. But my legs wouldn't move. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the monitor. My body was locked in place, cold sweat running down my back. And then I heard it. Not knocking, not scratching. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. I forced myself to move, reaching for the hunting rifle I kept by the door. My fingers wrapped around the stock, slick with sweat. My breathing was too loud. My pulse was a deafening roar in my ears. The footsteps circled the cabin. Once. Twice. Then they stopped. right outside my bedroom window. I stood there, rifle aimed at the window, waiting. The air was thick with silence, pressing down on me like a weight. And then, a single, slow tap against the glass. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step forward. The flashlight in my other hand trembled as I raised it. The beam landed on the window, and my stomach dropped. The figure was standing there, inches away, staring at me. Its skin was pale, too pale, almost gray. Its limbs were long, too long, stretched beyond what should be humanly possible. Its face, God, its face wasn't right. It had no eyes, just empty sockets, blacker than the night behind it. Its mouth was too wide, lips cracked and peeling, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. But the worst part, it was smiling. Not a grin, not a smirk, a stretched, impossible smile like it had been carved into its face. I staggered back, the rifle nearly slipping from my grip. My throat locked up, the scream trapped inside. And then, it moved. Not like a person, not like anything I had ever seen. 1 second, it was at the window. The next, it was gone. But the door handle turned. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep it steady. The handle twisted again, slowly, testing. And then, bang! I fired. The shot echoed through the cabin, making my ears ring. The door slammed open, hitting the wall. Cold air rushed in, and for a moment, all I could see was darkness. I took a step forward, my heart slamming against my ribs. The doorway was empty. The woods beyond were silent. Had I hit it? Had it run? I stepped outside, gripping the rifle so tightly my knuckles turned white. The ground was still, untouched. There were no footprints. And then I heard it. Laughter. Low. Twisting. Not from one voice, but from many. It was coming from the trees. I turned, my flashlight flickering. The woods stretched out in every direction, endless and impenetrable. The laughter grew louder, rising into a chorus of warped, overlapping voices. Then the whispers started. Soft, urgent, speaking in words I couldn't understand. And then, one word. My name. I bolted. I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door shut, locking it, barricading it with the heaviest furniture I could find. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I pressed my back against the wall, gripping the rifle, waiting. Silence. For minutes, hours, I don't know how long, I sat there, barely breathing. The whispers faded. The laughter stopped. And then, just before dawn, a single, quiet knock. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just closed my eyes and prayed it would go away. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bags and left. I never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, the moment the first rays of sunlight touched the cabin, I knew I couldn't stay another second. Whatever had been out there, whatever had whispered my name, knocked on my door, and stood grinning through my window, was still watching, still waiting. I barely remember packing. My hands worked on instinct, throwing clothes, supplies, and anything valuable into my bag. The rifle never left my side, though deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. I had fired at that thing. I had pulled the trigger, and it hadn't even flinched. Either I missed, or, worse, it couldn't be hurt. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I yanked open the door and stepped out onto the porch. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I forced myself to move. My truck was parked a few yards away, just where I had left it. I half expected it to be tampered with, slashed tires, a dead battery, something. But when I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, The engine roared to life. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't let my guard down. I didn't even bother checking the cabin one last time. I didn't care if I left something behind. The only thing that mattered was getting out of those woods. The dirt road stretched ahead, winding through the trees. I kept my eyes on the path, refusing to look into the forest. I knew what I would see if I did. A mile passed, then another. I started to think, maybe, just maybe, I was safe. Then, in the rearview mirror, a shape standing in the middle of the road. I only saw it for a split second, but my entire body went cold. It was the same figure. The long limbs, the empty sockets, the smile that didn't belong. I pressed my foot down on the gas. The truck roared forward, tires skidding on loose gravel. The road twisted and turned, but I didn't slow down. The cabin was far behind me now. I told myself I was almost out, almost free. But then, a voice right next to me, low, too close. It said my name. I didn't think. I swerved. The truck veered off the road, tires screaming. I gripped the wheel, fighting to regain control. The world blurred past me, trees, sky, dirt, and then, impact. The truck slammed to a stop. My head hit the steering wheel. Pain exploded through my skull. The engine sputtered, the metal groaning in protest. For a second, everything was still. Then, knocking. Not on the door. Not on the window. On the roof. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Another knock. Slow. Rhythmic. I reached for the rifle in the passenger seat. My fingers barely brushed the stock when... Silence! The knocking stopped. I forced myself to lift my head. Blood dripped down my temple, my vision swimming. The forest outside was empty. Nothing but trees and shadows. And then, in the mirror, a grin, just behind my shoulder. I don't remember what happened next. Maybe I blacked out. Maybe my mind just refused to process it. All I know is that when I came to, I was on the main road, speeding away from that place as fast as my battered truck could carry me. I didn't stop. Not until I reached a gas station hours later, my hands still shaking as I filled the tank. The attendant gave me a strange look. "You all right, man?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. In the reflection of the station window, a shadow, standing at the edge of the forest, still smiling. I didn't answer. I just got in my truck and drove. I never went back to that cabin. I never spoke about what happened. But even now, years later, I still feel it. Watching. Waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear it knock. It's been years since that night, but no amount of time can erase what happened in that forest. No matter how much I try to convince myself that it was exhaustion, paranoia, or some twisted trick of the mind, I know the truth. That thing was real. What I saw, what I heard, it wasn't my imagination. Something was in those woods with me, and it wanted me to know it. I never told anyone the full story. Not my friends, not my coworkers, not even the few people I've gotten close to since then. Who would believe me? A shadowed figure with hollow sockets and an impossible grin? A voice calling my name from empty spaces? Knocking that came from places it never should have? I can still feel it. I can still hear it. Even now, when I'm home in the city, surrounded by people and far from any forest, the memories creep in at night. I'll wake up drenched in sweat, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, convinced that I heard something. A knock. Soft. Slow. Just like before. I'll check the doors, the windows, every inch of my apartment, but there's nothing there. At least, nothing I can see. I never went back to the cabin. I sold the place for next to nothing, eager to put as much distance between myself and that cursed forest as possible. The new owner never contacted me, and I never asked any questions. But sometimes I wonder, did they hear the knocking? Did they see the figure watching them from the trees? Or, worse, did it follow me instead? Because some nights, when I walk past mirrors or catch my reflection in darkened windows, I swear I see it, just behind me, not moving, not speaking, just grinning, waiting. And deep in my gut, I know this isn't over. It never will be. It started as nothing more than an escape. He'd been living in the city, exhausted from the endless noise, the stress, and the feeling that everything was closing in. When I saw an ad looking for a seasonal worker to maintain a remote lighthouse, I jumped on it. The pay wasn't great, but it covered food and shelter, and for 3 months I would have complete solitude. No traffic, no emails, just the ocean, the wind, and my own thoughts. The lighthouse itself was ancient, built in the late 1800s. It had been updated with modern equipment, but the structure remained mostly untouched. It stood on a rocky outcrop, a 15-minute boat ride from the nearest fishing town. The only way in was by ferry, and the only way out was when the boat returned with supplies once a week. For the most part, it'd be alone. My job was simple: keep the lighthouse operational. That meant making sure the lights stayed on, the generators were running, and the place remained in decent condition. The main building had a small living area with a bed, a kitchen, and a bathroom. It wasn't luxurious, but it had everything I needed. There was no internet, only a crackling radio that connected me to the mainland in case of emergencies. At first, the isolation was a relief. My days had a peaceful rhythm: wake up early, check the lighthouse equipment, make coffee, and sit on the cliffs watching the waves crash against the rocks. The seagulls were my only company, and at night, the wind howled through the cracks in the old walls, a sound I quickly got used to. By the second week, I had settled into a comfortable routine. I'd wake up before dawn, climb the narrow staircase to check on the massive glass lens, and make sure it was rotating properly. After breakfast, I'd walk along the rocky shore, collecting driftwood or watching the fishing boats in the distance. It was simple, quiet, and exactly what I needed. Then, small things started to feel off. It was little at first: doors that seemed to move slightly even when they were shut tight, a faint creaking on the wooden stairs when I knew I was alone. The kind of thing you could brush off as just the wind, the age of the building, or your mind playing tricks on you. I told myself it was nothing. But then there were the footprints. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, I stepped outside to find a trail of wet footprints leading from the shoreline to the lighthouse door. Bare footprints, not boots, not shoes, just the shape of a person's feet imprinted in the damp ground. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. The island was empty. No one came here except for the supply boat, and that wasn't due for another 2 days. I checked the door, but it was locked just as I had left it. There were no footprints leading away. The idea of someone else being on the island with me sent a cold chill through my spine. But after searching the entire lighthouse, checking every room, the storage shed, even the rocky shore, I found nothing. No one. Just silence. I convinced myself I had missed something. Maybe a fisherman had come ashore and then waded back into the water. Maybe the wind had distorted the tracks. But part of me knew that wasn't true. And then the knocking started. The first time I heard the knocking, it was past midnight. The wind had been steady all day, howling through the cracks in the old walls. But this sound was different, sharper, deliberate. 3 slow knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. The lighthouse was old, full of creaks and groans, but this wasn't the building settling. Someone or something was knocking. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitated, then forced myself out of bed. The wooden floor was ice cold beneath my feet as I crept toward the door. The knocking had stopped, replaced by the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open. Nothing. The night was thick with fog, swirling around the lighthouse like a living thing. The wind bit through my thin shirt, but the air was silent. No footprints on the ground. No sign of anyone. Just the beam of my flashlight cutting through the mist. I stepped outside, sweeping the light across the rocky path leading to the cliffs. The ocean stretched out in front of me, black and endless. No boats, no movement. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wind had rattled something loose. I closed the door, locked it, and climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse. The massive Fresnel lens rotated steadily, casting its powerful beam across the sea. Everything seemed normal, but when I turned to head back down, I saw it. Handprint. Faint, smudged against the glass, just outside the lantern room. I froze. The handprint was too high up for someone to have left it from the ground. The only way to reach that height was from the inside, yet there it was, pressed against the outside of the glass. 5 long fingers. A human hand. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The lighthouse was tall, built on sheer rock with nothing but the sea below. No one could have climbed up here. And yet, someone had. I stayed up the rest of the night, pacing the small living quarters, forcing myself to dismiss what I had seen. Maybe it had been there all along, unnoticed. Maybe condensation had made it more visible. Maybe I was just tired. By morning, I was ready to put it behind me. The sun broke through the fog, and everything seemed normal again. The lighthouse stood firm, the waves rolled in like they always did, and I felt foolish for letting the night get to me. But then I found the door open. I knew I had locked it. I was certain. But there it was, just slightly ajar, the old wooden frame creaking softly in the breeze. I stood there for a long time, staring at the gap between the door and the frame. I didn't want to go inside. Something about the way the darkness stretched beyond the threshold made my stomach turn. But I forced myself forward, flashlight in hand, scanning every inch of the space. Nothing. Everything was just as I had left it. The blankets were rumpled from my restless night, my coffee cup still sat on the counter, and the radio hummed with quiet static. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I checked every lock, every window, every corner of the lighthouse. I searched the supply shed, walked the entire perimeter of the island, even shouted into the emptiness just to hear my own voice. No one answered. But that night, the knocking returned. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. And this time, when I looked through the peephole, I saw someone standing outside. The figure outside the door didn't move. I held my breath, my eyes still pressed against the peephole, barely able to make out the shadowy outline through the distorted glass. The knocking had stopped, but the presence remained, silent, waiting. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. Slowly, I backed away from the door. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and as if in response, the knocking started again. Louder. Faster. Then, silence. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight in one hand and an old rusted wrench in the other. My pulse hammered in my ears as I forced myself forward, inching toward the door. I reached for the handle. Stopped! The knob was ice cold. I yanked my hand back as a sudden gust of wind slammed against the lighthouse, rattling the windows. The lantern room above groaned with the force of the storm outside, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that this was all just weather, just wind and nerves. But then I saw the footprints. Bare, wet, leading away from the door, back toward the cliff's edge. I knew I hadn't heard anyone walk away. There had been no sound of retreating footsteps, no rustling of clothes, no shift in the air. But the prints were there, deep impressions in the damp earth, vanishing at the edge of the rocks. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where they disappeared. My stomach churned. No boat, no path, just sheer drop-off and crashing waves below. And yet, someone had stood outside my door. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jolt upright, every shadow twisted into something more sinister. I kept the flashlight in my grip, waiting for dawn. But even in daylight, the feeling didn't fade. The island was small, easy to search, but I found nothing, no signs of another person, no hidden boats, no explanation for what I had seen. I even checked the security of the supply shed again, making sure nothing was missing. Then I went back to the footprints. They were gone. Not washed away, not trampled, just gone, as if the ground had never been disturbed. The air was thick with the smell of salt, damp and heavy, but something else lingered beneath it, a scent I couldn't quite place. Stale, earthy, almost like decay. By the time night fell, the isolation of the island felt unbearable. I had been alone before, but this was different. This time, I wasn't sure I was alone. The knocking started earlier that night. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It came from the windows, from the walls, from inside the lighthouse itself. A frantic, erratic rhythm. Fast, desperate. I spun in circles, heart pounding, searching for the source. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but the light only illuminated empty walls, empty halls. Then the radio turned on. A burst of static, crackling through the silent room. I whipped around, staring at the old thing. I hadn't touched it all day, hadn't even tuned it in weeks. A voice warbled through the static, garbled, low, too distorted to make out. Then, clear as day, a whisper through the speaker. Open the door. I slammed my fist on the power knob, cutting the voice off. My breathing was ragged, my body locked in place. Then, footsteps. Not from outside, from above. I turned my gaze toward the ceiling, the lantern room. Something was up there. The stairs loomed in front of me, the metal railing cold under my palm. Every step felt heavier than the last as I ascended, my flashlight flickering with every unsteady breath. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the glass, rattling the beams. The door to the lantern room was slightly ajar, swaying with the draft. I stepped inside. The light pulsed, rotating steadily, casting long shadows against the walls. My breath fogged in front of me. The air was wrong, heavy, pressed against my skin like invisible hands. Then, in the reflection of the glass, a figure standing behind me. I spun, but the room was empty. My pulse pounded as I backed toward the stairs. My reflection in the glass twisted in the light, shifting with the movement of the beam. Then, a second reflection, not mine, standing right beside me. The breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure stood just behind my shoulder, tall, gaunt, its face blurred by the warped glass. But I could feel it, the weight of its presence. Then, in a flash of rotating light, it turned its head. Slowly, deliberately. I stumbled back, my body slamming into the stair railing. My flashlight flickered wildly, and the next rotation of the light revealed nothing. The reflection was gone, but the handprint was back, pressed against the glass from the outside. Only this time, there were 2. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I sat at the base of the stairs with my back against the wall, wrench still gripped tight in my hand, eyes locked on the lantern room above. By the time morning came, I felt like I hadn't breathed in hours. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening here, even if I wasn't ready for the truth. I wasn't safe anywhere. Not in the lantern room, not in the keeper's quarters, not even outside under the cold morning sun. The lighthouse had swallowed me whole, and whatever was inside it, whoever was inside it, wasn't going to let me go. I tried to fight the paranoia, to ground myself in routine. I checked the fuel for the light. I marked my logs. I forced down a meal I couldn't taste. But nothing felt real anymore, because I wasn't alone. By late afternoon, the exhaustion had taken its toll. My thoughts were slipping. I needed rest, even just an hour. I sat on the edge of my cot, rubbing my eyes. The room was dim, the thick storm clouds outside suffocating the last of the daylight. The lighthouse creaked and groaned with the wind. Then, a whisper, low, muffled, right behind me. I jerked around so fast my vision blurred, but the room was empty. The whisper came again. My breath caught in my throat. It was coming from under the bed. I gripped the edge of the mattress, heart pounding. My hand trembled as I lifted the sheet and shined my flashlight underneath. Nothing, just empty darkness. And yet, I felt it. Something was watching me. The whispering grew louder. It was right behind me. I lunged forward, spinning around, but there was nothing. The door to the quarters was closed. The windows were shut. I was alone. The whispering stopped. And then, the door unlocked. The soft click echoed in the silence. My breath was ragged, my pulse hammering in my ears. Slowly, I reached for the handle, hesitating. A single knock. Not from outside. From inside the room. The moment my fingers touched the knob, the door swung open on its own. The hallway was pitch black. The air was different now, thicker, pressing against my skin like an unseen weight. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, at the end of the hallway, a shadow, tall, motionless, watching me. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw it. A face, hollowed, stretched, twisted in an expression that didn't belong to anything human. Its eyes weren't there, just dark pits, empty and endless. The moment the light sputtered out, it moved. I slammed the door shut and threw my full weight against it. My chest heaved as I locked it, once, twice, 3 times, my shaking fingers fumbling over the bolts. Then the knocking started again, slow, rhythmic. And then, the voice. Let me in. My body locked up. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't even threatening. It was calm, almost gentle. But it wasn't human. The doorknob twisted. I bolted. I didn't stop until I reached the lantern room, my breath burning in my chest. The air was icy, my skin damp with sweat, but I didn't care. I barricaded myself inside, pressing my back against the metal door, gripping the wrench so tight my knuckles ached. The lighthouse shuddered with the storm outside, the rotating beam casting long shadows against the walls. I tried to slow my breathing, tried to steady myself. Then, the radio crackled to life. A burst of static, warped voices. And then, through the distortion, my own voice. Help me. I stopped breathing. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't an echo. It was me, begging, pleading. Help me, please. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Then the door handle rattled. Not just rattled, pounded, harder and harder, the metal vibrating under the force of it. Then the screaming started. Not words, just raw, guttural wailing. I pressed my hands over my ears, sinking to the floor, my body shaking violently. It was inside. It was inside the lighthouse. Then, as suddenly as it started, silence. The only sound left was my own heartbeat, erratic and desperate. I stayed there for what felt like hours, gripping the wrench, eyes locked on the door. Then, footsteps. From above. above the lantern room, where nothing should be. I looked up. The ceiling was glass, and staring down at me, a face, the same hollowed out, stretched thing I had seen in the hallway. Its mouth hung open too wide, its empty sockets locked onto mine. Then it slammed its hands against the glass. The entire lighthouse trembled. The glass cracked. I ran. I don't remember how I made it down the stairs. My body moved on instinct, my mind screaming at me to get out, get out, get out. I hit the main door and yanked it open, and everything went silent. The storm was gone. The wind had stopped. The air outside was still, thick with the scent of salt and rot. And at the edge of the cliff, standing motionless, the figure, watching me, waiting. I didn't stop. I ran straight for the dock. I didn't care that the boat wasn't supposed to arrive for another week. I didn't care about my gear, my supplies. I just needed to get off that island. I reached the dock, and the boat was there. A small fishing boat rocking gently in the water. No one was inside. No ropes. No anchor. It was just there, waiting. I didn't question it. I jumped in, untied the line, and shoved off. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because I knew if I did, it would be standing right behind me. The boat rocked beneath me as I rowed, my arms burning, my breath ragged. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, shrinking with every pull of the oars, but I never let my eyes linger on it. I couldn't, because if I looked too long, I knew it'd see it. The figure, the thing that had been watching me, the thing that had been inside the lighthouse with me. The water was unnaturally still. No waves, no wind. Just an eerie silence stretching across the ocean. It was as if the world itself had been paused, waiting for something. Waiting for me. The sky was dark, clouds thick and unmoving, suffocating the last traces of light. I didn't know how long I had been rowing. Minutes? Hours? Then, a sound. A whisper. It came from the water. I stopped. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the black waves around me. Nothing. I reached for the oars again. The boat lurched, like something had grabbed it from underneath. Panic surged through me. I rowed harder, faster, my hands slick with sweat and salt. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the dark horizon, on the distant shape of land. Then, the boat tipped. A jolt. Sudden. Violent. I barely caught myself, my heart slamming against my ribs. My flashlight slipped from my belt and tumbled into the water. I watched it sink, its beam flickering as it disappeared into the abyss below. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a shadow moved beneath the surface. Large. Impossible. And I knew it was down there. I wasn't safe. Not in the lighthouse. Not in the boat. Not anywhere. I forced my body to move, my muscles screaming as I rowed, putting as much distance between myself and that cursed island as possible. Then, a voice, right beside my ear. "You can't leave." I screamed. The boat rocked violently, the whisper turning into a chorus of distorted voices, each one overlapping, clawing into my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the oars so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept rowing, pushing against the weight of the unseen, against the horror that clung to me. Then, the mist came, thick, heavy, wrapping around the boat like fingers. I couldn't see the island anymore. I couldn't see the horizon. All that existed was the fog and the whispers. Then, a light, faint, flickering, a beacon. I turned toward it, my breath catching in my throat. It was the lighthouse, the same lighthouse, but it was in front of me, not behind. The boat rocked harder now, the water churning violently. The whispers grew deafening. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't allowed to leave. Then, horn. Loud, sharp, cutting through the fog like a blade. I turned toward the sound, and there it was. A ship. A real, solid ship. The supply crew. Their voices were calling out. I could barely make out their figures through the mist, but they were real. Human. I screamed for them, waving my arms frantically. The boat lurched again, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Then a hand grabbed me. Rough, calloused, real. They pulled me aboard. The moment my feet hit the deck, the mist lifted. The water was calm. The sky was clear. And when I turned back, the lighthouse was gone. The island was gone. Nothing but open water remained. The captain wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, his eyes filled with concern. "Where the hell did you come from?" he asked. I couldn't answer. My body trembled, my mind reeling. The crew spoke in hushed tones, glancing at me like I was something fragile, something wrong. They said they had seen nothing but open sea, no island, no lighthouse. Just me, alone, drifting in a boat that shouldn't have been there. When we reached the mainland, I was questioned. Authorities pressed me for details, but I had nothing concrete to give them. No proof. No explanation. The lighthouse logs were missing. The island wasn't on any recent maps. It was as if it had never existed. But I knew the truth. It was still out there. And it was still watching. Because when I got home, exhausted and hollow, I found something waiting for me. Sitting on my desk, untouched, was my logbook. And inside, written in my own handwriting, was a single sentence. "You never left. I don't talk about the lighthouse anymore. Not because I've forgotten. I could never forget. It's burned into my mind like a scar, something permanent, something I carry with me whether I want to or not. But because no one believes me. I tried at first. When I got back to the mainland, I told the authorities everything. I told them about the island, the lighthouse, the figure in the tower. I told them about the whispers, the boat, the way I had seen the lighthouse in front of me when it should have been behind. They looked at me like I was insane. "There's no lighthouse out there," they said. "No island either." And when I insisted, they pulled up maps, records, anything they could to prove that what I had seen didn't exist. That's when it sank in. It wasn't just that they didn't believe me. It was that, to them, it was impossible. There were no recent records of the island I had spent months on. No documents about my assignment. My contract, gone. My logs, gone. Even my initial request to take the job had vanished from my emails. It was like I had never been there at all. And yet, I still had the logbook. I still had the scars on my arms from when I had fallen in the tower. I still had the nightmares, the suffocating, real nightmares of the figure standing at the top of the spiral stairs, watching, waiting. I tried moving on. I got a new job. I went back to a normal life. But it never felt real anymore. Because every now and then, strange things happened. Little things. I'd wake up to find the lighthouse logbook open on my desk, even though I kept it locked away. I'd hear the distant echo of a foghorn in the middle of the night, even though I lived nowhere near the ocean. I'd see flashes of light in the distance when I drove along the coast, just for a second, just long enough to make my stomach drop. And then there was the dream. The same one, over and over. I'm back in the lighthouse. The stairs stretch up forever. The wind howls through the cracks in the walls. The lantern room glows faintly above me. And something is waiting at the top. It doesn't move. It doesn't speak. But I know what it wants. It's waiting for me to come back. And one day, I'm afraid I will. Because last night, when I woke up, my bed was covered in salt water. And the logbook was open to the last page. A new sentence had appeared beneath my last entry. Not in my handwriting, not in anyone's handwriting. Just 3 words, written in black ink, fresh and wet. You remember now. And that's how I know the lighthouse isn't done with me. Not yet. It was early December, and I had just finished a long, exhausting road trip across 3 states. I had been driving alone for hours, the endless stretch of highway blurring together under the dim glow of my dashboard. The weather had turned sour as the sun dipped below the horizon, and soon I was navigating through sheets of rain that pounded against my windshield. My destination was still a couple of hours away, but I knew I couldn't keep going. The fatigue was setting in, and my hands had started gripping the steering wheel tighter, my body tensing with every flicker of my headlights against the wet asphalt. I needed to stop. That's when I saw it. A hotel just off the highway, its neon sign flickering in the rain. The letters were old and faded, but still readable. The place didn't look inviting, not in the way chain hotels do, with their bright lobbies and neatly trimmed bushes, but it was standing, and it had a glowing vacancy sign. That was enough for me. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, my tires splashing through puddles. There were only a few other cars, scattered and forgotten looking. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and hurried through the rain toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit. the air thick with the scent of old wood and something else I couldn't quite place. The reception desk sat in the middle of the room, and behind it stood an older man with deep lines on his face, his skin weathered like cracked leather. He barely looked up as I approached. "Need a room for the night," I said, shaking the water from my jacket. He slid the guest book toward me without a word. No computer, no modern check-in system, just an actual physical book. The pages were yellowed and slightly curled at the edges. I hesitated, but only for a second, before signing my name. The old man reached under the counter and pulled out a key. Not a key card, an actual metal key. "Room 306, he muttered, setting it on the desk. "Third floor. End of the hall." There was something unsettling about the way he said it, his voice flat, almost reluctant, but I was too tired to care. I took the key, nodded, and turned toward the elevator. The hotel wasn't huge, but it had that strange, stretched feeling, like the hallways were longer than they should be, the ceilings just a little too high. The carpet under my feet was a dull red, worn and stained in places. The elevator let out a weak ding as the doors creaked open. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the third floor. The ride up was slow, the kind of slow that makes you feel every second pass. The dim overhead light flickered once before settling into a steady hum. My reflection in the elevator's scratched metal walls looked as tired as I felt. When the doors finally slid open, the hallway ahead was empty. The kind of empty that made my footsteps sound too loud against the carpet. The doors to the other rooms were all closed, their numbers slightly tarnished. My room was at the very end, just like the old man had said. I unlocked the door, stepping inside. The room was normal, old like the rest of the place, but nothing unusual. A bed, a small desk, a chair in the corner, a bathroom to the left. The window had thick, heavy curtains that blocked out the rain outside. I tossed my bag onto the bed and shut the door behind me, locking it out of habit. The exhaustion hit me all at once. I barely had the energy to change into something dry before collapsing onto the mattress. The sheets smelled slightly musty, but at that moment, I didn't care. I just needed sleep, but sleep didn't come easy. At first, it was just the wind outside, rattling the window panes. Then, the occasional groan of the old pipes somewhere in the walls. Normal sounds. Expected sounds. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, another noise started to creep in. A faint creaking. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, but then it happened again. And again. Soft, deliberate, like footsteps. I sat up, listening. Silence! Maybe another guest, I told myself. Someone walking down the hall. But when I strained my ears, there was nothing. No doors opening, no muffled voices, no sound of movement outside my room. Just the quiet hum of the heater and the distant drip of rain against the window. I lay back down, shaking off the unease creeping up my spine. I closed my eyes. And then, just as I started drifting off, there was a knock. A soft, deliberate knock on my closet door. At first, I didn't move. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady, pretending I hadn't heard it. Maybe I hadn't. Maybe I was already half asleep, and my brain had twisted some normal sound into something it wasn't. But the knock had been so distinct, sharp, deliberate, too close to ignore. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the digital clock on the nightstand. 2:37 a.m. I swallowed, forcing myself to listen. Nothing. The wind had died down outside, and the hotel had fallen into that strange, heavy silence that only happens in the middle of the night. I turned my head toward the closet, the door barely visible in the dim light. It was shut, exactly as I had left it. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings creak, air vents shift, wood expands and contracts. My mind was exhausted, and I was letting it get to me. I rolled onto my side, pulling the blanket up over my shoulder, trying to ignore the tension coiling in my stomach. My body felt tight, every nerve on edge, waiting for something else to happen. And then it did. A second knock. Not loud, not aggressive, just the same soft, controlled tap. 3 knocks, as if someone or something was waiting for me to respond. A sharp chill crawled down my back. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow. My eyes stayed locked on the closet door. The room felt different now, heavier, like the air had thickened, pressing against my skin. I forced out a small, dry laugh. "Okay," I muttered under my breath. "This is stupid." I reached for my phone on the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the closet. The door was still closed. There was nothing unusual about it. No shadows shifting underneath. No movement. Just a plain wooden door. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to get up and open it, just to prove to myself that there was nothing there. But another part, the deeper, more primal part, wanted me to stay exactly where I was. I wasn't a kid anymore. I didn't believe in monsters hiding in the closet. But something about that door felt wrong. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cold against my bare feet. I stood up slowly, my breath tight in my chest. The flashlight beam wobbled slightly as I took a step closer. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool metal of the doorknob. And then, another knock. I yanked my hand back like I had been burned. This time, it had been louder, more urgent. Something was on the other side. I took a shaky step back, my throat dry. Every rational thought in my head screamed that this wasn't possible. I was alone. There was no way someone could be inside that closet. I clenched my jaw, gripping the flashlight tighter. I couldn't just stand there. If I didn't open the door, I would never sleep. I inhaled deeply, forcing my nerves to settle. "All right," I whispered. "Let's get this over with." I reached out again, grasping the knob. My fingers felt stiff, almost numb. I turned it. The door creaked open an inch, then 2, then fully. I lifted the flashlight, aiming it inside. Nothing. Just an empty closet. A single wooden hanger swung slightly on the metal rod, as if it had just been touched. But aside from that, it was completely normal. No hidden compartments, no vents, no space for anyone to hide. I let out a shaky breath, laughing under my breath. Jesus! I closed the closet door firmly, double-checking that it latched shut. I turned back toward the bed, shaking my head at myself. But just as I took a step forward, the closet door creaked back open. I froze. It hadn't just popped open a little. It had swung wide, stopping just short of hitting the wall. My throat tightened. My mind struggled for an explanation. I had closed it. I knew I had. Slowly, I stepped forward again and reached for the door. This time, I pushed it shut hard, testing it. It didn't budge. I exhaled sharply. My nerves were shot. I needed to sleep. I grabbed the chair from the small desk and dragged it in front of the closet, wedging it under the doorknob. I wasn't playing games anymore. With one last glance, I crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. I tried to ignore the way my skin prickled, the feeling of something unseen watching me. The clock on the nightstand read 2:49 a.m. I closed my eyes. And then, just as I started drifting off, the sound of something heavy shifting inside the closet. A scraping noise. And a breath. Not mine. I knew what I had heard. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the wind, the pipes, or the old wooden frame of the hotel settling. It was something inside the closet. Something real. For a long moment, I lay there, barely breathing, listening. The scraping sound had stopped. The room was silent again, but that didn't make it any better. The silence felt charged, like something unseen was holding its breath, waiting for me to react. The flashlight was still clutched in my hand. I hadn't turned it off. I tilted it slightly, angling the beam toward the closet. The chair I had wedged under the doorknob was still in place. The door hadn't moved. But that didn't mean something hadn't. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to sit up. My pulse pounded in my ears as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was ice cold under my feet, and I shuddered, though I wasn't sure if it was from the temperature or something else entirely. I needed to check. I had to prove to myself that there was nothing there. Slowly, I stood, every nerve on edge. The air in the room felt different, heavier, like stepping into a place where something terrible had just happened. I hesitated, gripping the flashlight tightly. My free hand hovered over the chair blocking the closet door. Something about this felt wrong, but I couldn't just leave it. With a deep breath, I grabbed the chair and pulled it back. The sound of the legs scraping against the wooden floor made me flinch. I reached for the doorknob. My fingers barely brushed it when a loud thud slammed against the inside of the closet. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight shook in my grip as I aimed it at the door. My breath caught in my throat. Nothing. No movement. No further sound. But the door, the entire door, had shuttered. I should have run. Any normal person would have left the room, gone straight to the front desk, demanded a new key, and never looked back. But something in me refused to move. It wasn't just fear, it was anger now. I was exhausted. I had barely gotten any sleep since I checked in, and I wasn't about to let some weird noises ruin another night. I clenched my jaw and yanked the door open. The closet was empty. No footprints in the dust along the wooden floor. No hidden doors. No gaps in the walls. Nothing. I exhaled slowly, stepping closer. My skin tingled, every instinct screaming at me to back away. I swept the flashlight along the inside of the closet one more time, and that's when I saw it. The back wall of the closet, it wasn't solid. There was a small seam running vertically, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. I pressed my palm against it, and the wood gave slightly under my touch. A hidden panel. My mouth went dry. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to open it or pretend I had never seen it. But before I could decide, a new sound filled the room. Soft breathing. Right behind me. I spun around so fast that I nearly dropped the flashlight. The beam wobbled as I scanned the room. Nothing. The door to the hallway was still locked. The windows were shut. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. But I knew what I had heard. And I wasn't alone. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs as I turned back to the closet. My breath felt thick in my throat. I reached out and pressed harder against the panel. It shifted slightly. A gap appeared. Just an inch. A rush of cold air drifted out. I angled the flashlight, trying to see beyond the opening. My stomach twisted. There was a space behind the closet wall. A narrow, dark passage, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The air that seeped out smelled old, rotten. My pulse quickened. Someone had been in here. Maybe they still were. I took a step back. I had to get out of this room. I turned toward the door, grabbing my phone off the nightstand. My fingers shook as I fumbled with it, trying to pull up the hotel's front desk number. And then, the closet door slammed shut on its own. The sound echoed through the room, deafening in the silence. I backed away fast, nearly tripping over my own feet. My breath came in ragged gasps. And then my phone screen glitched. For a second, the home screen flickered, then turned black. A second later, white text appeared across the screen. Don't open the wall. I froze. The message vanished as quickly as it had appeared. My phone rebooted itself. My fingers went numb. I couldn't breathe. I turned back toward the closet, my skin crawling. The panel was still slightly ajar, the dark gap visible. Something inside that space didn't want to be found. Or worse, something inside didn't want me to leave. I needed to make a decision. Either I left this room immediately and never looked back, or I found out what was really hiding inside this hotel. My breathing was uneven, my fingers trembling as I clutched the flashlight and stared at the closet. The message on my phone still burned in my mind. Don't open the wall. The words hadn't been a warning. They had been a threat. And yet, despite every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave, I couldn't. I needed to know what was in there. With slow, deliberate movements, I grabbed the closet door and yanked it back open. The old wood creaked, the air thick with that same rotting smell. It wasn't just decay. It was something deeper, something wrong. The panel in the back of the closet was still slightly ajar. That thin, dark opening, waiting. I didn't want to go near it. But something about it felt unfinished. Like the story of this room had been paused mid-sentence. And I was the one meant to turn the page. My throat was dry as I stepped closer. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I raised it, aiming the beam into the gap. What I saw made my stomach drop. The passage behind the closet was no ordinary crawl space. It was a narrow corridor, one that stretched further than it should have. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, streaked with something dark. I didn't want to think about what it might be. The passage led straight into another room. But that didn't make sense. There was no door to this room on the hotel's layout. I had checked the floor plan online earlier. It shouldn't exist. But it did. I had two choices. Run, leave this cursed place, pretend I never saw what I just saw, or go in. I should have chosen the first option. Instead, I stepped inside. The air in the passage shifted the second I crossed the threshold. The temperature plummeted. The smell thickened. I could hear something, faint breathing, but it wasn't mine. I took another step forward, keeping my flashlight trained ahead. My own shadow stretched long and distorted along the faded walls. The passage was too quiet. No hum of the hotel's heating system. No creak of old pipes. No distant sounds of guests moving around. It felt like I had stepped out of the hotel, like I had entered somewhere else entirely. And then I saw it. The chair. It sat in the middle of the hidden room, facing the wall. An old wooden chair, its backrest scratched deep, as if someone had clawed at it with bare hands. The wall it faced was covered in scratches. Tally marks. Hundreds of them. I swallowed hard. Someone had been trapped in here, and they had been counting the days. I lifted my flashlight higher, scanning the rest of the space. The walls were warped, stained dark. The air felt thick, almost heavy. Then I heard it. A creak. Not from the floor, from the chair. It shifted slightly, rocking back as if someone had just gotten up. I stumbled back, my pulse slamming in my ears. The temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in visible puffs. Something wasn't here with me. And then, the flashlight cut out. Darkness swallowed me whole. Panic surged through my chest. My fingers fumbled over the flashlight, smacking the side, trying to get it to turn back on. Nothing. The air around me shifted. Something moved. A scraping sound against the floor. I wasn't alone. The chair creaked again. And then, in the blackness, a whisper. Right next to my ear. You shouldn't have come here. I felt hot breath against my skin. I lunged backward, slamming into the wall. My head spun, panic clawing at my chest. The flashlight flickered back on, and I saw it. A figure, standing right in front of me. No eyes, no mouth, just a shadowy shape of a person outlined against the flickering light. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It moved toward me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. And then I saw its hands. Long fingers covered in deep scratches. The same scratches that marked the chair. The same ones covering the walls. This thing, whoever it had been trapped here. And now, it wanted me to take its place. The air grew heavier. I felt pressure against my chest, like invisible hands were pushing me down. The walls seemed to close in. The chair rocked violently on its own. I was losing control. And then, I ran. I bolted out of the hidden room, shoving my way back through the closet passage. The second I stepped into my hotel room, the air felt different. The heaviness was gone. The smell vanished. I spun around, panting. The closet door stood wide open. But the passage, it was gone. The back of the closet was solid wood again. No seam, no hidden gap, like it had never existed. But I knew the truth. It had been there. Something had been there. And it had seen me. I barely had time to process what had happened before my phone vibrated in my hand. I looked down. Another message. White text on a black screen. You made the right choice. This time. My stomach twisted. My legs felt weak beneath me. I had almost become part of whatever nightmare was buried in this hotel. I wasn't going to give it a second chance. I grabbed my things and left the room, my hands still shaking as I locked the door behind me. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about my reservation. I just needed to get out. And as I walked down that empty hallway, heading toward the lobby, I swore I heard something. A soft creak, like a chair rocking, back and forth, somewhere in the walls. The night air was thick and humid as I stepped out of the hotel. My heart was still hammering in my chest. My hands trembled as I shoved them into my pockets, trying to ground myself in reality. The city lights glowed faintly beyond the empty parking lot. The distant hum of traffic felt almost alien, too normal, too distant from what I had just experienced. I took one last look at the hotel. From the outside, it was just another old building. No flickering lights, no ominous shadows lurking in the windows. But I knew what was inside. Something had been waiting in there, watching, and it had almost taken me. I walked faster, heading straight for my car. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated. A thought gnawed at me. Was I really free? Was it just the hotel that was haunted? Or had something followed me out? I clenched my jaw and pulled open the door, sliding into the driver's seat. The silence in the car was suffocating. The air felt too still. I hesitated before turning the key. My reflection stared back at me in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide, almost unrecognizable. For a brief second, I thought I saw something else. A shadow just behind me. I spun around, my pulse slamming in my ears. Nothing. The back seat was empty. I exhaled sharply, forcing out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. I was letting paranoia take over. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I didn't waste any more time. I pulled out of the parking lot, the hotel shrinking in my rearview mirror. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had seen me, and it wasn't done with me yet. The aftermath. The next morning, I sat in a diner 2 towns over, staring at my untouched coffee. I hadn't slept. Even after putting miles between myself and that hotel, the feeling hadn't left me. The weight, the sense that I was being watched. I had checked into a different motel, triple locking the door, keeping every light on. But sleep never came. And when I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of scratches on the walls, a chair rocking on its own, a whisper, close enough to feel. I gripped the coffee cup tighter, willing my hands to stop shaking. I needed answers. I pulled out my phone, hesitating before searching the hotel's name. Pages loaded, old reviews, a few scattered news articles. And then, a link to an old forum post. I clicked it. The post was nearly a decade old. Does anyone know what happened in room 306? My stomach twisted. That was my room. I scrolled down. The replies were fragmented, but the message was clear. Something bad had happened there. A man had stayed in room 306 years ago. He had been found days later, locked inside the closet. His fingernails had been worn down to the bone because he had been scratching at the walls, trying to get out. The official cause of death? Starvation. But the post said something else. The door wasn't locked from the outside. It was locked from within. I sat there, my hands cold, my pulse pounding. That passage in the closet. Had that man been trapped there? Or had something else been in there with him? A new reply had been added to the thread just a few weeks ago. If you ever stay there, don't open the wall. Don't go into the passage. And whatever you do, if you hear the chair creak, leave. Immediately. My stomach churned. I had done all of it. I shoved my phone away, pushing back from the table. The walls of the diner suddenly felt too close. I needed air. I stumbled outside, my breath ragged. The morning light should have been comforting, but it wasn't, because I knew something now. The hotel had tried to keep me, and it almost did. Unanswered questions. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I found myself driving aimlessly, replaying everything in my mind. The closet, the corridor, the tally marks on the wall, the figure. There was no logical explanation for any of it. But logic didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the truth. I had stepped into something I shouldn't have, and somehow I had gotten out. But the worst part, I wasn't sure if I was really free, because when I checked my phone again, there was another message waiting for me. No number, no name, just 4 words. You left too soon. And suddenly, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The highway stretched endlessly before me, an open road leading anywhere but back to that hotel. The farther I got, the more I told myself it was over, that I had escaped, that whatever had happened in room 306, in that passage, in that darkness, was behind me. But some things don't stay buried. Some things follow you. That night, I checked into another hotel, nothing special, just a roadside stop with bright fluorescent lights and a tired-looking clerk who barely glanced up as I handed over my ID. Room 214, he mumbled, sliding the key across the counter. I took it and headed upstairs, moving through the motions as if nothing had changed. The door creaked as I stepped inside. The room smelled of old fabric and cleaning supplies. The bedspread was stiff, the furniture outdated, but it was normal. That's all I needed. Normal. I locked the door behind me, checked it twice, then threw my bag onto the chair in the corner. It didn't rock. Ed. The silence pressed in as I sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through my hair. I should sleep, but my body was still wired, muscles coiled tight, like I was waiting for something. I checked my phone. No messages. I exhaled. Maybe the text was just a glitch. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was finally in the clear. I wanted to believe that. But then, something moved. Not outside. Not in the hallway. Inside the room. A slow, deliberate creak. From the chair. The one where I had thrown my bag. The one that hadn't moved before. It was rocking now. Back and forth. Back and forth. I couldn't breathe. My body locked up, every instinct screaming to run, to get out, to leave everything behind and never look back. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Because there, in the reflection of the TV screen, someone was sitting in the chair. And they were looking right at me. Hospitals have always made me uneasy. The smell of antiseptic, the dim fluorescent lights that hum softly, the quiet beeping of machines, it all felt unnatural. I never thought much of it though. I told myself it was just the way hospitals were. Places of sickness, suffering, and sometimes death. But I never imagined it experienced something that would change the way I see them forever. It all started when I took a job as a night security guard at an old hospital on the outskirts of town. The place had been operational for decades, but was gradually being phased out in favor of a newer, more modern facility. Parts of the building had already been shut down, entire wings left abandoned, but there were still a few active floors where patients were treated. The hospital wasn't empty, but it often felt that way. I needed the job. I was between places, struggling to keep up with bills, and the position paid well for what seemed like easy work. All I had to do was patrol the halls, check the surveillance cameras, and make sure nothing was out of place. It sounded simple enough. At first, it was. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd walk the halls, listen to the faint sounds of nurses moving from room to room, and watch the monitors in the security office. Occasionally, I'd hear a patient muttering in their sleep or the sound of someone shuffling down the hallway. But nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. There was an eerie stillness in the air, though. Something about the way the hospital felt at night put me on edge. The fluorescent lights flickered just a little too often. The silence felt heavier than it should. I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. But I brushed it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, adjusting to the long hours and empty hallways. I wasn't the only one working the night shift. There were a handful of nurses, a doctor or two, and another security guard, an older guy named Ray. Ray had been working at the hospital for over 20 years, long enough to have seen its best and worst days. He was friendly, but there was something about him that felt off. He rarely spoke unless I started the conversation, and when he did, his voice was always low, almost like he was afraid someone else might hear. One night, as we sat in the security office watching the monitors, I asked him if anything strange ever happened during his shifts. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, then let out a dry chuckle. "You'll see soon enough," he said. That was all he offered. No explanation, no warning, just that cryptic response. I should have pressed him for more, but I didn't. I told myself he was just messing with me, trying to spook the new guy. But part of me wondered if there was something more to it. The hospital itself was a strange place. The active floors were sterile and modern, but the older, abandoned wings felt like they belonged to a different era. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, the floors scuffed and cracked. Some rooms still had rusted hospital beds inside, sheets draped over them like forgotten relics. The smell of mildew and dust filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of something I couldn't quite place, something old. I was told to avoid those areas. There was no reason for me to be there, and I had no interest in wandering through empty, decaying hallways alone at night. But the longer I worked there, the more those hallways called to me. One night, as I made my rounds, I found myself standing at the entrance of one of the abandoned wings. The doors had been left slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I hesitated. The air felt different there, heavier, colder. But I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I don't know what made me stop that night. Maybe it was the way the door to the abandoned wing stood open just enough to make it seem like someone had passed through recently. Maybe it was the draft that seeped out, carrying with it a musty, cold scent that didn't belong in a temperature-controlled hospital. Or maybe it was just curiosity, something that should have been easy to ignore, but for some reason wasn't. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness beyond the doorway. The lights inside had long since been shut off, leaving the hallway in deep shadow. The only thing illuminating it was the faint glow from the active corridor behind me, which barely stretched past the threshold. I wasn't supposed to be in there. That much was clear. But something about the way the door had been left open, just slightly, felt deliberate. I reached out and pushed the door open wider. The hinges groaned, the sound louder than I expected in the stillness of the hospital. A gust of cold air hit me as the door swung fully open, like stepping into a different world entirely. I should have turned away. Instead, I took a step forward. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with old hospital rooms on either side. The doors were all closed, their windows covered in grime. The air smelled stale, thick with dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. I pulled out my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness in thin, shaky lines. There was no reason for anyone to be here. The security cameras in this part of the building had been disabled years ago, and according to Ray, the place had been locked up tight since the hospital started shutting down sections. But someone had left that door open. As I walked further in, my footsteps echoed down the empty hallway. I forced myself to stay calm, listening for any sound beyond my own movements. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A faint, shuffling sound. I froze, my grip tightening around the flashlight. The sound had come from deeper in the wing, past the bend in the hallway, where the light no longer reached. It was quiet, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone else was here. My first thought was that it had to be another employee, maybe a nurse or even Ray checking on something. But no one was supposed to be in this section, and if they were, why hadn't I seen them enter? I swallowed hard, my pulse drumming in my ears. "Hello," I called out. My voice came out steadier than I expected, but the silence that followed made the air feel even heavier. Nothing. I took another step forward. The floor creaked beneath me, the old tiles shifting slightly under my weight. I pointed my flashlight toward the source of the noise, but the beam only revealed more empty hallway. Then, just as I was about to turn back, something moved. A shadow, quick, almost too quick to register, slipping into one of the rooms at the end of the hall. I stopped breathing. My hand instinctively reached for the radio clipped to my belt, my fingers hovering over the button. I wanted to call Ray, tell him someone was in the abandoned wing, that I wasn't alone. But something held me back. I wasn't sure what I had just seen. It didn't look like a person. The way it moved was wrong, too fluid, too fast. A trick of the light, maybe? My mind struggling to make sense of the darkness. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the room where the figure had disappeared. The door was slightly ajar now, just enough to show that something or someone had gone inside. I had two choices. I could walk away, pretend I hadn't seen anything, and finish my rounds like nothing had happened. Or I could check inside, make sure there wasn't actually someone wandering around where they shouldn't be. I exhaled slowly, gripping my flashlight tighter. I stepped forward. The hallway felt longer now, the distance stretching unnaturally as I approached the door. I kept my eyes locked on the sliver of darkness beyond the doorway, half expecting something to come rushing out at any second. But nothing did. When I reached the door, I hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open with the tip of my flashlight. The room inside was dark and empty. Just an old patient's room, the bed still in place beneath a thin sheet, the cabinets covered in dust. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints on the floor, no signs that anyone had been inside recently. But I knew what I had seen. I stepped further in, sweeping my flashlight across the walls. The air was colder here, enough to make my breath feel heavy in my chest. Something about this room felt wrong. I turned to leave, my nerves getting the better of me, when I heard it. A whisper, right behind me. I spun around so fast that my flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering to the floor and rolling until the beam pointed toward the far corner of the room. There was nothing there. I snatched up the flashlight with shaky hands, backing toward the door. My pulse hammered in my ears, my skin prickling with something I couldn't explain. I stepped into the hallway, my breaths uneven. I needed to get out of this wing. I didn't care if I got in trouble for leaving the door open. I just wanted to be away from whatever was in that room. As I turned to leave, my radio crackled to life. "Everything okay?" Ray's voice came through, staticky and low. I hesitated before pressing the button. "Yeah, just thought I heard something." "Silence!" Then, after a long pause, Ray responded, "Get out of that wing. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I left without looking back, without stopping to close the door behind me. When I reached the security office, Ray was already waiting for me, his face pale. He didn't ask what I saw. He didn't need to. "Stay out of there from now on," he muttered, turning back to the monitors. I wanted to ask him what he knew, but the way he looked at me, like he had seen this happen before, kept me quiet. That was the first night I felt it. The hospital wasn't empty. Not really. And whatever was in there, it had noticed me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow move, slipping into that room at the end of the hall. I heard the whisper behind me, felt the cold breath of air that had no business being in a sealed-off wing. No matter how much I told myself it had to be my imagination, My body refused to believe it. The feeling of being watched, of something unseen lingering just beyond my vision, stayed with me. I wanted to forget about it. I wanted to go back to my regular shifts, joking with Ray and going through the motions like I always had. But something had shifted that night. It was like I had crossed an invisible line, and the hospital knew it. And it wasn't going to let me ignore it. The next few nights, small things started happening. At first, it was easy to brush off. The occasional flickering light, a strange noise in an empty hallway, security footage cutting out for a few seconds before coming back with nothing out of place. But then it got worse. The first real sign was during my rounds 2 nights later. I was walking past the nurse's station on the 3rd floor when I heard a phone ring. That was already strange. Most of the landlines in the hospital had been disconnected or replaced with internal comms. But this wasn't coming from an active station. It was coming from the abandoned wing. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding as the ringing continued. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, stretching out in a way that didn't feel natural. I pulled out my radio. "Ray, you hear that?" There was a brief pause. Then his voice came through, tight and uncertain. "Yeah, don't answer it." That was all he said. I stood there, frozen, as the phone kept ringing. Then, after a long moment, it just stopped. I didn't go into that wing. Not that night. But I should have known it wasn't going to leave me alone. The shadow returns. 2 nights later, I was checking the cameras when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just static. A brief distortion in the feed from the 4th floor hallway, right outside the abandoned wing. But then I realized it wasn't the cameras. It was something moving. A shape, dark and featureless, stepping just into the frame before slipping back out of sight. My chest tightened. My hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. The rational part of me wanted to rewind the footage to prove to myself that it had just been a glitch. But some deeper, instinctive part of me, the part that had felt that presence behind me in the empty room, knew better. I switched to another camera. The hallway was empty, but something was there. I could feel it. I should have called Ray, should have told him what I saw. But instead, I grabbed my flashlight and went to check for myself. The hospital was silent as I made my way up to the 4th floor. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled against the old linoleum. The closer I got to the abandoned wing, the heavier the air felt, like stepping into a room that hadn't been touched in years, where the dust never fully settled. I stopped outside the same door that had been left open nights before. This time, it was shut. For a long moment, I just stood there. Then, as I reached out to test the handle, not in the way an old door might creak open from age. No, I heard the distinct click of a lock disengaging, as if someone on the other side had just turned the knob. The hair on my arm stood up. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave. But I didn't. I had to see. I pushed the door open. Inside, the hallway was the same as before. Dark, cold, the air thick with dust. The only difference was the room at the far end. The door was open now, light spilling out into the hallway. I hesitated. Every step forward felt like I was moving through water, the weight of the air pressing against me. I reached the room, stopping just outside. The light was coming from an old hospital bed lamp, the kind they used for night shifts. It flickered slightly, casting weak shadows on the walls. The bed beneath it was covered in a thin sheet, pulled up as if someone had been lying there. And on the wall above it, smudged into the grime, like someone had pressed their palms against the surface from inside the room. My breath hitched. I stepped back, my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. Then, just as I turned to leave, I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back at the security office, slamming the door shut behind me. Ray was there, staring at me like he already knew what had happened. "You went back, didn't you?" His voice was flat, resigned. I didn't answer. He sighed, rubbing his temples. It's getting worse. I looked at him, my pulse still hammering in my ears. What do you mean worse? Ray hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an old security log. He flipped through it, stopping on a page from over a decade ago. Then he slid it across the desk toward me. My stomach dropped as I read the report. Security officer found unconscious in abandoned wing. Reported seeing someone standing in the hallway. Sustained severe injuries from unknown source. Quit immediately after incident. The name was scratched out, faded with age. I looked up at Ray. This has happened before, I whispered. Ray nodded. And it's not done yet. After that night, I stopped trying to convince myself it was my imagination. Something was in that hospital. Something that had been there for a long, long time. And now, it knew me. The activity escalated. The phone in the abandoned wing started ringing every night at the same time. Lights in active areas flickered when I walked by, plunging hallways into sudden, suffocating darkness. But the worst part was the voices. They started soft at first, just faint murmurs in the distance, like overhearing a conversation from another room. Then they got closer. One night, as I was making my rounds near the old maternity ward, I heard it clear as day. A voice right behind me. Why did you come back? I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway was empty, but the air had changed. It was charged, electric, like something was waiting just beyond my vision. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. Then, just as I turned the corner, a shadow moved in the reflection of a darkened window. Not behind me, beside me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran, and this time I knew whatever was in that hospital wasn't just watching anymore. It was following me. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow in the reflection, standing too close to me. I could still hear the voice, low, breathless, asking that one question. Why did you come back? At work, I kept my head down. I stuck to my regular rounds, stayed in well-lit areas, and refused to go near the abandoned wing. But it didn't matter, because it was coming to me now. It started small, objects moving when I wasn't looking, my radio cutting to static when I passed certain hallways. The security cameras would glitch, the screens flickering with shadows where there shouldn't be any. Ray noticed. I could tell by the way he kept watching me, his usual easy demeanor replaced with quiet concern. You look like hell, man, he muttered one night, tossing me a can of soda. You need to talk about it? I hesitated. Then I told him about the voices, about the reflection, about how, no matter where I went, I could feel it there, just at the edge of my vision, waiting. Ray didn't laugh. He didn't call me crazy. He just sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. I was hoping it wouldn't get this bad. I stared at him. What do you mean, this bad? Ray looked at me, then down at his desk. After a long pause, he stood and walked over to the filing cabinet in the corner. I watched as he pulled out a thick, worn folder and dropped it in front of me. Read it. I opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages. And that's when I saw them. Reports. Dozens of them. Security officers, nurses, even a few patients, all describing the same things. Shadows moving in empty halls, whispering voices, cold spots, doors unlocking on their own. And then, at the very bottom of the stack, I found the worst one. A missing person report. My hands went cold as I read the details. A security guard, just like me, disappeared in the abandoned wing. Never found. Only one thing had been left behind, his radio. Still turned on. The last thing he ever said, I see it. I swallowed hard, looking up at Ray. This is real, isn't it? Ray nodded. Yeah, And it's not gonna stop. I exhaled shakily. What happened to the others? Ray hesitated. Some quit. Some changed. They weren't the same after. One guy lost it completely. Said something was following him home. I stared at him. Did it? Ray didn't answer. And that's when I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. If I didn't face it now, it would only get worse. That night, I made a decision. I was going back into the abandoned wing. Not out of curiosity, not out of bravery. I had to end this. I didn't tell Ray. If he knew, he would have stopped me. I waited until the hospital was quiet, then grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the 4th floor. As I approached the sealed-off hallway, the air grew heavy. The lights flickered. Something was waiting. I reached the door, the one that had unlocked itself before. It was already open. I stepped inside. The hallway stretched in front of me, the same eerie silence pressing in from all sides. The flickering light at the end of the corridor cast long, shifting shadows. The room with the hospital bed, the one where I had seen the handprints, was still open. But this time, I wasn't alone. As I stepped closer, a figure stood in the doorway. Not a shadow. A person. At least, that's what it looked like at first. They were tall, wearing what used to be a hospital gown. Their skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over their bones. And their eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye. They were staring at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, in a slow, jerky motion, they tilted their head. I stepped back. My foot scraped against the floor, breaking the silence. The figure's mouth twitched. Not into a smile, not into anything human. Just a movement, a reaction, like it was studying me. Then, in a voice that wasn't mine, it spoke. You shouldn't have come back. A perfect echo of what I had heard before. The voice wasn't right. It sounded warped, layered, like multiple people speaking at once. My body finally caught up to my brain, and I turned and ran. As soon as I moved, I heard it following me. Not running, not walking. Something else. A sound that shouldn't exist. I sprinted down the hallway, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst. The walls blurred past me, the flickering lights casting erratic shadows. I reached the door, and it slammed shut. I yanked at the handle. Locked. Behind me, I heard it coming closer. The sound of something dragging across the floor. I slammed my fist against the door. Ray! Ray! Open the door. Static filled my radio. Then, a voice. I see it. I froze. That was the last thing the missing guard had said. I turned, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The figure was right there. I saw it clearly now. Its face was wrong. Not just inhuman, unfinished. Like someone had started molding a person out of wax, but stopped halfway. The skin was cracked, shifting, like it was trying to become something else. Trying to become me. My vision blurred. My head pounded. The air felt too thick, pressing against my chest. I was going to pass out. Then, suddenly, the door burst open. A hand grabbed my arm, yanking me out of the hallway. Trey! He pulled me through, slamming the door shut behind us. The second it closed, the noise stopped. Silence. But I knew it was still there. Watching. Waiting. I didn't waste any time after that night. I filed my resignation the next morning. I didn't care about the 2-week notice. I just wanted out. Ray didn't question it. "Good call," he said, sliding my paperwork across the desk. "I'll finish the shift with you tonight. After that, you're done." I nodded, grateful that I didn't have to argue. That last shift was the longest of my life. Even though I stayed out of the abandoned wing, the hospital felt different, heavier, like the walls were closing in. Every noise made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. And worst of all, I knew it was still watching. I felt it the whole time. The same oppressive presence lingering in my peripheral vision. But I never turned around. I never looked. Because if I did, I knew it'd see it. The moment the shift ended, I left without a word. I didn't even clear out my locker. I just walked out the front doors and never looked back. That was supposed to be the end of it. But it wasn't. For weeks after I left, my nights were filled with nightmares. The hospital halls, the dragging sound, the echo of my own voice. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my chest tight, my ears ringing with static. At first, I thought it was just lingering fear. My mind playing tricks on me. Until the real signs started. Objects in my apartment weren't where I left them. My closet door would be open in the morning, even though I always closed it before bed. And then, one night, the whisper came. Soft, breathless. "I see it." I shot up in bed, my body locked in fear. My radio from the hospital was still in my duffel bag. Turned off. Unplugged. But in the silence of my room, I heard the static. I got rid of everything from that hospital. My uniform, my name tag, my radio, I burned them. I moved to a new apartment, changed my number, cut off contact with anyone from the hospital. For a while, things were quiet. No nightmares, no voices. I convinced myself it was over. Until I saw it. It happened late one night. I was coming home from work, exhausted, my mind on autopilot. I took the elevator up to my floor, unlocked my door, and stepped inside. And froze. My living room mirror, I had left it covered. But the sheet was on the floor. And in the glass, standing right behind me, was a reflection that wasn't mine. My stomach dropped. The air in the room thickened. Slowly, I turned around. Nothing. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there. Still staring. Still smiling. Then, in my own voice, it spoke. "Why did you come back?" I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just closed my eyes and whispered, "I didn't." And when I opened them, the reflection was gone. But I knew the truth. It wasn't finished with me. It never would be. I moved again. Another city, another job, another attempt at leaving it all behind. But some things don't stay buried. No matter how far I go, I still feel it. At first, I told myself it was just paranoia. A remnant of fear that wouldn't let go. But deep down, I know better. It's there. Not in the shadows. Not in the mirror. But in me. I never should have gone into that abandoned wing. I never should have listened to the static. But it's too late to change any of that now. There's something about those places. Places filled with suffering, fear, and death. They hold on to things. And sometimes, those things follow you home. I've stopped talking about it. Telling the story doesn't help. It only makes the memories sharper, the fear stronger. But I still check my mirrors. I still keep the lights on. And every now and then, in the quiet hours of the night, I hear it. A soft, breathless voice. I see it, and I wonder, is it still watching me? Or am I just waiting to see it again?